All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. Try to check out important theories and discoveries and concepts that you probably never heard of. They've been suppressed, and this is number 278 in our Bible Decode series. We have been going through different texts that I think will help us when we are trying to decode or understand what's going on in the Bible. I think a lot of the things that we do learn will help us down the road. I think the most important thing that I'd like to stress in terms of Bible research is not what is in the Bible. It's not so much, I mean, it is, but it's not so much what is in the Bible, but what is the Bible. A lot of people, when they start their Bible decode, they just start reading the Bible, and that's fine, but you really can't quite get what's in the Bible until you figure out what is the Bible. Who wrote it? When did they write it? What did they write it for? What's the overall context of who are these people who wrote it? What are they writing about? And those are questions that just don't usually get asked, and they don't get answered well either. A lot of people, you ask them, what is the Bible? The Bible is the Word of God. Well, perhaps if you have enough faith, you can say that. But if you are really a follower of truth, and you are interested in the truth, that answer is not good enough, because that answer requires faith. And so, you may have faith that somebody else doesn't have. I see no evidence that the Bible is the Word of God. I can't provide any evidence for that other than my faith. Every other book that I've ever seen was written by a human. And so the only thing that there is faith that separates the Bible from any of these other books. And that's also true in terms of just the history of it. If you look at, for example, the Old Testament, when I first read the Old Testament, it was later in my life. And by the time I had read it, I had read many of the other ancient books, ancient texts, so when I'm reading the Old Testament, I'm like, well, I've heard this story before. Whether it's Adam and Eve, or Cain and Abel, or Noah and the flood, or any of the other kind of stories coming out of Genesis. It's like, well, I've heard this story before. Well, it's because these stories are all from other books that are way older than the Bible is. The Sumerian text. Now, I don't read these languages, so we'll have to say I have to trust some type of translation of all those books, including the New Testament and the Old Testament. But I read the story of Adam and Eve in the Sumerian, and with much greater detail, a much greater amount of detail, and a lot of aspects of that story are not in the New Testament. And then I recognize that the Sumerian version is like 1,000, 1,500 or more years older than the Bible. But when we look at the Sumerian, or we look at some of these Babylonian texts, other Near Eastern texts, we consider them to be mythologies. that this is a mythology. This is not something that really happened. It's something that they wrote down as a map or something to guide people, in right and wrong and ethics and so on. But it didn't really happen. But it's just a tale that teaches you lessons. But when we read the same story in the New Testament, there are a lot of people that consider it to be historical. So how is it that the original story is a myth, but the derivative story is historical? So these are questions that you have to ask, and also, but just where did these texts come from, and what are they talking about? All of the different terminologies that they're using. Most people, when you read these various texts, you just kind of skip over names and place names that you're not familiar with. And you kind of focus on, if you're reading the New Testament, you focus on Jesus' activities. But there's a lot of peripheral stuff that is very important to any type of decode that we're glossing over. And so I want to pay attention to those kind of things, which I would consider to be, suppressed or whatever. And in particular, we've been looking at the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 until 96 AD, that wrote the story as a psychological operation against the Jews, and really to also convince other people within the empire about this Jewish Messiah, who, rather than being a military commander to help the Jews overthrow the Romans, instead this Jewish Messiah was a Prince of Peace, and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, and so on. This is was a technique that the Romans used, creating religions for psychological operations, and this was in order to mellow out or to tame or domesticate the Jews, which was certainly needed because the Jews had been a big pain in the side of the Romans for over a century, with all kinds of uprisings and insurrections and riots and assassinations and flat-out revolutions. And they had just gotten done fighting these Jews in a war for 7 years. It took them 7 years to put down the Jews. So they didn't want a repeat of that, and so they went with this psychological operation that we now call the Gospels. So we've examined that from many different standpoints and looked at the evidence of all that, and you can check that out in many of the older videos here. And we've also examined a lot about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 1940s and 1950s in a series of caves near Qumran in Judea, near Jerusalem, 20 miles from Jerusalem. And these scrolls included all of the Old Testament writings, or just about all of the Old Testament writings, usually with many copies of each book, as well as a lot of sectarian material, which is like specific to this sect of very pious Jews who lived as monks, more or less, at this fortress at Qumran. Now the texts are priceless, and the Old Testament stuff is historic in that it is by far the oldest set of texts of the New Testament, of the Old Testament, that exists by a long shot. But the sectarian material is very explosive in that it gives you a view of life there at that time, whether it is the 1st century AD, 1st century BC, or even the 2nd century BC, and what was important to those people, what their rules were, what their daily life was like, and for those who think that the documents are from the 1st century AD, what does this have to do with Jesus? And because Jesus would have been living at approximately that time, does it have any relation to do with the New Testament? Now, we know it definitely, has a lot to do with the Old Testament because it's got all those books. But most of those books are close to being word for word translations of the text that we already have. So they don't provide a great deal of additional information. But this other stuff, the sectarian material, is what scholars were after. Unfortunately, these texts were given custody. Custody was given to these Dominican Catholic priests who promptly looked at them, saw something that they didn't like, and so they refused to divulge the contents. They were supposed to be translating them and releasing them to the public, but they never really got around to doing that. They would drip out one somewhat irrelevant text once in a while, once every couple of years they would drip one out. But really after 40 years, the general public as well as theologians were in the dark about what these texts actually said. Eventually, this guy, Robert Eisenman, among others, kind of forced the text out there, really by, through lawsuits and, legal action, forced these texts to get out and see the light of day. And that's what we're looking at today, as we're looking at one of Eisenman's books called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. This is part of a compendium of books and articles that he has that's called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And this is a difficult book. It's really for specialists in the field, and there's phrase after phrase and term after term that may be unfamiliar to you. I'm going to try to fill in the best I can, but to be honest, this book is kind of over my head. But that shouldn't stop us from reading it, because there's some valuable information that can be gleaned. You just have to plow forward and recognize that you probably have to read this book again, and you probably have to read it 3 times to pick it up. And in fact, we have just been skipping over the footnotes. Then maybe the next time through we'll get to the footnotes. But for now, we're just trying to, because I think Eisenman does a good job of clarifying some of the terminology, and that's important when you're decoding something. If you hear one source call it one thing, and another source call it another thing, you need to be able to have kind of the glue to figure out, okay, they're talking about the same thing. Some of these people have different names depending on what language is being used. That's another major factor that puts that you put in here. All of these Dead Sea Scrolls are written mostly in Hebrew, some of them in Aramaic, just a couple of them in Greek, whereas the New Testament is written in Greek. And the companion book to the New Testament, which is Josephus's War of the Jews, is also written in Greek. You really need to read Josephus's War of the Jews to be able to decode the New Testament, in my opinion, because you can see that they're running parallel to each other, and they're bouncing back and forth off each other, meaning that, in my opinion, they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And so if you recognize that the New Testament is a psychological operation written by the Romans, basically because Josephus is also written by the Romans, neither of them are particularly trustworthy then, which creates a vacuum in first century scripture. First century, our understanding of the first century. And that's the Dead Sea Scrolls can fill a lot of that gap. So, just try to hang in there with the Eisenman, and you'll pick up a few nuggets that you'll be able to put in your pocket and use later. You might not understand the entire, trajectory, especially since we're picking it up right in the middle of chapter 5 here. That this Boethusian priesthood abjured the doctrine of resurrection of the dead is probably attributable to its overseas and earlier roots. These are discernible in both Ecclesiasticus, an apocryphal text. Apocryphal basically just means like spurious, meaning it's not part of the canon, but it's not far off the canon. Okay, so despite its preservation in all the localities so far described, the Samaritan Zadokites, Zadok coming from the high priest of David and Solomon, and/or Solomon, and that dynasty passed down, but it also means righteousness. Going back to a time before its introduction by the Maccabean or Hasidian practitioners of holy war. And the Maccabees were holy warriors. They basically, through conquest of the Seleucid Greek Syrians who controlled Judea in the 3rd and 2nd centuries, early 2nd century BC, the Maccabees overthrew them and gained a level. They were Jews, and they gained a level of sovereignty for the Jews for about a century in the 2nd and 1st century BC. And but they were hardcore. They would force you to be circumcised on pain of death and that kind of thing. And a lot of their stuff is written up in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are apocryphal texts, but they are actually part of the canon for some groups, including possibly Catholics. Not quite sure about all that, but so these are terms that are part of his title: Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. So at least we can understand the title now of the book. The Pharisees, true also to their Hasidian roots, embraced the new doctrine. As we have discussed, Simon probably broke with this original Hasidian movement. Now, this is Simon going back to the 1st century BC, one of the Maccabees. 2nd Maccabees is anxious to counter the charge that Judas Maccabeus, who was the son of Mattathias Maccabeus, so these are some of the early Maccabees, Judas and Mattathias. So 2nd Maccabees is anxious to counter the charge that Judas was not a Hasidian and pointedly ignores the subsequent priesthoods of Jonathan and Simon with their Pharisaic tendencies as being unworthy of note. Now, you remember that the Pharisees are the group of Jews who were the big problem for Jesus in the New Testament, and they are different than the Sadducees for, I guess, a bunch of different reasons, but one is that they believe in the resurrection, whereas the Sadducees don't. and that the Pharisees eventually led into this rabbinic Judaism school, whereas the Sadducees were pretty much wiped out by the war that we're talking about, 66 to 73 AD. So we're jumping around a little bit from the 1st century AD back to the 1st century BC and even 2nd century. And I wish Eisenman would actually include a few more dates in here. I find that to be true of a lot of history that I read, is that the historian doesn't include dates. And maybe it's just me, but I think in terms of dates. I like to put a timetable together in my head. So when I write history, I use a lot of dates. But anyway, associated with the pietistic Sadduceeism that believed in resurrection of the dead and was more zealous for the law even than the Pharisees, was the production of apocalyptic literature, which in turn gave rise to both the Messianic and Zealot movements of the 1st century CE. This pietistic Sadducee movement did not follow Pharisee halakha, nor its style of expressing this in traditions culled from the practice and teachings of the fathers, much like Sunni Islam. Rather, in the style of the Temple Scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls. In the style of the Temple Scroll and much other similar literature at Qumran, including Jubilees, the movement expressed itself in pseudepigraphic pronouncements of an exoteric kind, whether halakhic or apocalyptic. I do not know what halakhic means. Pseudepigraphic basically means like forgery or false writing. This is the literature found at Qumran. It is massive as it is widely disseminated through the Oriental world via Jewish Christianity, other zealot or messianic movements. In fact, all groups outside the orbit of Phariseeism and official Judaism and apocryphal literature. As the disappointment of its messianic hopes became permanent, its covert tendencies increased, and its ideas grew ever more esoteric. I'd like for him to explain why there was the disappointment of the messianic hopes. Perhaps because of the earthquake in 31 BC that destroyed the monastery that they eventually rebuilt at the end of Herod's reign, I believe. Like Herod's reign ended in 4 BC. Or maybe there's another reason, but its covert tendencies increased and its ideas grew ever more esoteric. These, in turn, were transmitted to various groups outside the orbit of official Judaism and Christianity in the East, namely Ebionites, Elkasaites, Manichaeans, Gnosticizing groups like the Sabaeans, Mandaeans, and at Nag Hammadi, which is where the Gnostic Gospels were discovered just a few years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these are scrolls that were discovered that contain all the Gospel of Thomas and all these other Gospels and other apocryphal New Testament writings. And even Syriac Christians, Nestorians, and Jacobites. Many of its fundamental ideas, while distorted by subsequent overlays, were preserved in Kabbalah, and traces of them are clearly discernible in Karaite and Islamic literature, most notably in its Shiite variation. Indeed, the latter is the Islamic counterpart to the Zadokite movement, as we have described it, as Sunniism is to Rabbinism. Now that I did not know. I still don't know it, but now at least I have that opinion in my head. So the Shiite Islamists is similar to the Zadokite movement, and the Sunni Islamist is similar to the Rabbinic or Pharisaic movement, according to Eisenman. Judas Maccabeus, following in the footsteps of Simeon and Onias before him, is the quintessential Zadok or righteous teacher type. Now, the righteous teacher is language that is directly from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are really three characters in some of their sectarian literature: the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, and the liar. And so Eisenman is trying to figure out who is who, coming from the Bible. Like, so if we're talking about what's going on in the New Testament, is this relevant to the Dead Sea Scrolls? And so he contends that the teacher of righteousness is James, the brother of Jesus. And others contend that the teacher of righteousness is John the Baptist. And then still others contend that the teacher of righteousness is Jesus. So that is, a lot of the interest of the Dead Sea Scrolls is who is who. Are we talking about the same story? Are we talking about something else? So, now he's saying that Judas Maccabeus is the quintessential Zadok or righteous teacher type who, in Rechabite / Essene style, withdrew into the wilderness, usage current at Qumran, and lived like a wild animal, presumably in caves, eating nothing but wild plants to avoid contracting defilement. He is the type of the warrior high priest presented in the War Scroll. This is not to say that any Qumran identification should be attached to Judas, either in the Peshers, which is like a kind of a Jewish decoding device using wordplay, which are late, or the Damascus documents, the date of which for the moment must remain indeterminate. The Damascus documents are also one of the Dead Sea Scrolls writings. Judas, too, is probably observing the extreme purity regulations associated with lifelong Naziritism, reflected in both Philo's and Josephus's description of Essene practices, including sexual continency. As such, he is probably the model for John the Baptist, Jesus, and James. One could also add Simeon bar Cleophas, Jesus' probable second brother, called a Rechabite priest, meaning Essene, he says, in Eusebius. Now, Eisenman is not hip on the Roman origins hypothesis, but under that, the whole concept of the Essenes is very problematic. In that he mentions Philo and Josephus' description of Essene practices. Unfortunately, these are two of the only three people who've ever from that time period who ever mentioned anything about the Essenes. The other, I think, is Pliny, some other Roman. Now, Philo wasn't particularly a Roman. He was from one of the richest families of Alexandria, and he was a Jew, and so was Josephus, but Josephus defected to the Romans, and Philo was very, very close with the Roman royal family of the Flavians. His nephew Tiberius Alexander was actually one of General Titus's lieutenants, more or less, and ended up also living at the court of the Caesars at Rome. So these people can't be taken seriously when you take their writings. Their writings are propaganda and not history. The mere existence of the Essenes is in question, in my opinion, and now many Christians believe that Jesus was an Essene, that he was a member of the Essenes. I have great doubts about the existence of either of those two, but the point's still the same. Whether you call them Essenes or whether you call them Zealots, or whether you call them Qumran, Dead Sea Scroll people, it's still the same idea, but you might call them something different. Where sexual continency is at issue, though argument from silence is not a proof, in each of the above-mentioned cases it offers a strong presumption. As far as James is concerned, all early church accounts make a point of calling him holy or a Nazarite from his mother's womb. And in Judas's case, any children would have changed the political picture for succeeding generations considerably. However, none are mentioned. Contrariwise, Judas's uncle Simon took care to dispose of the children of his brother Jonathan, who were killed under very questionable circumstances, thereby ensuring the succession of his own heirs. At this point, one is probably witnessing the break between the Hasidians supporting Judas and holding his memory sacred, and the faction increasingly influencing the actions of Simon, by this time already beginning to be called Pharisees, in his machinations to gain endorsement for his priesthood from the several Syrian kings and pretenders. Judas is simply from the original and more pietistic wing of the Zadokite movement, and proves it by the manner of his life, imitated to a certain extent by John the Baptist and Jesus, and in the zealot manner of his death. He makes a pious end, as do John, Jesus, and James, among numerous others after him. So, zealous for the law